Point of order, this review is primarily meant for those who have actually played this game, although I've tried to make it as universally acceptable as possible. With that in mind, there are spoilers, so ye be warned. Okay, here we go.
Gather round, kids, for the backstory of Thomas is Alone!
Way back in October of 2010, there was a little game jam that Mike Bithell of Blitz Games attended. There, he worked on a little Flash-based game incorporating the theme of friendship based on a Coen Brothers movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, which kind of played out like a combination of Homer's The Odyssey, around 5 pounds of satirical cheesy 90s-esque camaraderie, and some vomit. After completing this game, Bithell published it on Congregate, then subsequently removed it so that he could wedge a story somewhere in there. Take note of how the gameplay was made before the story, because if you're paying attention later, you'll see how this is relevant. Then, taking inspiration from New York's most hipster of paintings, he became a lead designer of Bosa Studios, then launched a massively popular Indiegogo crowdfunding project to make the small Flash game into the pillar of gaming history that it is. An interesting point about this is that Bosa Studios, while credited with being the developer and publisher on Google, refuses to acknowledge any part of its help with creating on both its Wikipedia page and its own website. Hell, even Steam says it was just created by Bithell Games, which leads me to believe that Bithell and Bosa didn't have the best relationship during the creation of this game, or this was just his side project baby. Even Curve Studios, which helped port the game, will admit that it had a hand in creating this game, so maybe Google should just get on correcting itself. On the 12th of November 2012, this game was released to the public to a stupidly high level of praise. Thomas Was Alone was, according to the media, nigh flawless despite its advertisement as a simple little indie game with simple graphics and simplistic gameplay. So what happened? Why did people cream that corn when this game was released? And is this hype an over-exaggeration or a sign of a god-tier game that only gets released once in a blue moon? Let's delve in and find out. 2012 was, as weird as it sounds for such a recent year, a different time. Thomas Was Alone came out in the year that gave us such mega macho AAA titles as Mass Effect 3, Assassin's Creed Benjamin Franklin, Max Payne 3, Einstein's Question, and overpraised The Game. The game capitalized on a year of the AAA to find some kind of humbler, simpler origins. For God's sakes, nothing says we're not competing with other games for sales quite like releasing your game the day after Black Ops 2. It advertised itself as simple, fun, and easily accessible, something every gamer could enjoy, even, and this was practically a swear word in 2012, casual gamers. You play as Thomas, a red rectangle and a colorful cast of friends that have backstories plastered onto them about as cheesily as a Breakfast Club clone. Only this story takes the idea of sensationalizing the trivial out of the juxtaposition of teen self-centricity and loses all self-awareness by having a story that doesn't make the point out of this sensationalization. Instead, the player leads a Sesame Street-esque line of four-sided shapes on a magical quest to... Well, it's not explained what they do in the story until about halfway through, but in gameplay terms, the player wants to move on, so it's forgivable to attach a character's agency congruently to the player's. Gameplay is pretty simple in principle. You guide a series of differently skilled rectangles to outlines in various levels by means of jumping, sliding, and other forms of puzzle solving. New characters introduce new abilities, and new levels test these abilities, with level progression offered as a reward. A nice and easily understood concept that, again, in principle, I have nothing against. There's also this neat little achievement system in the game where you grab little cupcakes in strategic locations every few levels that require a little bit more skill to reach, but once you grab them, they're achieved forever, so I couldn't actually get the game footage to show these. It wasn't a huge boon to gameplay, but it wasn't exactly a bad move either. You use the spacebar to jump and the A and D keys to move left and right across a two-dimensional environment with different abilities offered with every character you come across. Thomas is pretty versatile, Chris is smaller, John jumps high, Clara can float in water, Peter defies gravity, Laura can be used as a trampoline, and Sarah jumps twice. The player switches back and forth between control these characters as they are used in a cohesive manner to reach their goal. Most of the levels in the game can't be conquered without using some sort of teamwork, which not only teaches a player to use the elements of the game to their fullest abilities in a complementary fashion with one another, it also makes the rectangles the player controls feel distinct from one another, yet at the same time feel like a team that the player is a part of. This helps form an emotional connection to the game, which allows a player to be engrossed in a game rather than just engaged, furthering any kind of emotional reaction from the game. If anyone interested, Emily Brown and Paul Cairns did a study on game immersion that touches a lot of these points that I highly recommend, so a link to the study is in the description. Side note, if I had to pick a favorite character, it's Chris. Eventually in the story, you find characters that outperform him in every way, so in a way the game didn't intend, I found some kind of sadistic delight playing him, knowing I could be achieving better results with the other characters. Literally, Sarah on her own is better than Chris in every way. Rest assured, this isn't just a game for babies. I genuinely believe there is some good to be found in this game, and there certainly were parts I found challenging, and parts where I straight up sucked. The graphical quality goes from fastest to fantastic. Okay. Good news, no matter what you choose, you really don't notice. Bad news, no matter what you choose, you really don't notice. At least the controls are simplistic. When a game advertises itself as a simple game, it needs to deliver itself on those premises. The simple graphics admittedly pair very well with the gameplay, which is just barely hard enough to make an adult gamer stop for a second or two to figure out what to do, but simple enough so that kids and idiots could beat the game too. Most of the time, I actually like the learning curve of this game, which is perfectly balanced for almost any gamer that comes into contact with a keyboard/controller. The only complaint I would have in this way is that I got the impression that a couple of cues were unintentionally wrong-footing me about how to play the game in the name of making a spectacle. Hell, sometimes the game would actually withhold cues to move forward until you took leaps of frickin' faith.
Maybe I should jump across to this. Okay. Sorry, sir. Just trying to go up.
Should I really be butting heads with the game itself when it comes to moving forward in the game? Or is this just sacrificing conveyance for the feeling of, whoa, the game is changing around me? Some parts of the game stretch this to be straight up unnecessary. One particularly obvious example of this was around when Claire, the big blue square of buoyancy, was being introduced, and the game created puzzles specifically designed to tailor you to her abilities. Check it out. So in this level, you're just ferrying dudes across, and whoops, they fall in the water. Alright, cool. This teaches the player that the level's static platforms will push you off of Claire if you're on her. Now the player knows to move Thomas and John off of her to across the platform. Cool! So what's the point of the second one? Literally, what's the point? It just wastes your time. The players already learned how to combat this situation by clearing the first of these platforms. If they didn't learn, they wouldn't have passed the first one. The second one doesn't teach you anything. And I don't buy that it reinforces this teaching either, because gamers can pick up on these things kinesthetically through experience pretty damn quick. This literally only exists to be a time sink instead of testing you, which offers nothing as a player. Was this your favorite part of Thomas Was Alone? Of course it wasn't. It was nobody's favorite part unless they were a masochist. God! This game is riddled with things like this. Luckily, it's basically the only source of the gameplay's downfall, except for stupid things like when Sarah refuses to jump twice and instead jumps once, or Laura refuses to move with Claire despite how others will, which just seems like a bug. In fact, speaking of Sarah, talking about this just makes me wish there were more moving platform instances like her double jump tower, or the spiky circling platform of Doom, which offer genuine challenge because a lot of this game frankly feels like filler to support its story. Sorry, not sorry. Okay. Maybe I'm being unnecessarily salty. Let's see what the plot has to offer. Okay, is this really how exposition in the game is given? Silent paragraphs? Luckily, no. The game has an admittedly great narrator, Danny Wallace, reading aloud more paragraphs in an attempt to inject humor and sarcasm and plot into the game.
Thomas was alone. Wow. A weird first thought to have.
Now, Danny Wallace isn't a noob in the scene of voice acting in games. The more perceptive of listeners might recognize him as the voice of Sean Hastings from the majority of the Assassin's Creed line of games. In fact, he even wrote one of the Assassin's Creed games. 3. You know, the one with the worst writing and plot, forever proving that the author of Yes Man should probably stick to non-fiction works. As great as Dan Man is, there's an inherent problem with the way that the game is presented right off the bat, and it's a pretty big one. As the game progresses, it becomes increasingly apparent that the game, plot-wise, is essentially a book. Completing levels is the equivalent to turning a page, and your actions have no result in the story. This is especially a problem in Thomas Was Alone, because while the exact same argument can be given for games like Ocarina of Time or Portal in that you progress through a game to find its predetermined ending, at least those games have you do the actions that harmonize with the rhetoric. Swinging a sword at baddies in Ocarina makes sense because it's part of the gameplay, and in the story that baddie is an evil dude that you want to kill. You use portals in Portal to get stuff to press buttons because you're a test subject. The rhetoric is formed around the idea that you're trying to use your intellect to solve puzzles. You could make the argument that this is done in Thomas Was Alone, but you'd be lying to yourself. The equivalent of this is basically, Thomas decided to go left until he reached the portal, and everything else the narrator tells you is up to your own imagination to determine whether it's actually a thing or not. No, literally. The game blabs on about camaraderie of squares, and if you don't allow yourself to be immersed, the game falls apart. And it's not an obligation of the player to be immersed based on player-game contract. You can see yourself defeating bosses and becoming a hero in Ocarina of Time. You can see yourself being treated as a test subject in Portal. But in Thomas Was Alone, the game is actually depending on you to believe the story to make it real instead of how it should work, i.e. the other way around. This first occurred to me a couple of levels in. When Chris first appeared, you had to help him get up higher than his jumps would allow via jumping on Thomas. In the gameplay, they're working together. Duh, right? However, even then, the narrator acts as if Chris isn't being benefited by this whole thing. The story basically ignores the gameplay as if the gameplay is just interfering with what it's trying to tell. It's kind of like the world's worst middle school musical where all the kids ignore each other and just talk over one another. That's basically the story of this game. Don't believe me? Play the game and try to ignore this truth bomb, which is more like a truth nuke. The gameplay isn't enhanced at all by the story, and the story isn't at all benefited by the gameplay. No, I'm serious. Play the game and try your best to ignore the story and just move blocks. Sure, you'll be a bit more confused and weirded out, but the gameplay is still the exact same, only now you're referring to the blue thing as a blue thing and not Claire the overweight superhero. Sure, you're more attached to the character if you know that it has a name and backstory, but to say that justifies having the name and backstory is basically parroting Peter's stupid argument of, could you eat that steak if you knew the cow had a name? I don't care if the cow was Rosetta Tharpe herself. That right there is an attempt to supplement story as opposed to weave it into the gameplay itself. It goes the other way too. Imagine if all of the dialogue was taken out of the story and put into a book with images of the characters plopped in for reference. The story would still be just as much there as it was in the game. The fact that you need to press keys just makes you need to pay more attention, thus you pay more attention to the story. That's what makes everyone and their freaking grandma think that this game has depth, because they chose that depth. This game taught me that even pixelated characters could be deep. No shit! Any John Green novel reading starry-eyed naive little porcupine could be inspired to fall in love with a rotten banana if the story's written well enough, but that doesn't mean you're not gonna get rotten banana in your urethra come wedding night. The story is good, but it's just as good if it were in a picture book for kids. The only way it's improved is dependent on the viewer. And yes, that's my fancy way of saying that's my opinion, but if the entirety of Thomas Was Alone's story and characters depend on me, and I don't like it, then the game should have accounted for that and made some kind of objective position for the story and its environment. Want an example? Okay. People who have played Thomas Was Alone know about the love affair between Laura and Chris, that one rectangle and that other rectangle, although some might call him a square. You might recall that one point when Chris was doubtful to help, but then Laura gave him that smile, giving him confidence. So in any good game, the scene would have showed us this connection, right? Well, at least it wouldn't have shown that, like, there was no way that it could have happened in the ludic space, right? Like, oh, I don't know, having 4 sets of walls in between Chris and Laura? That's genuinely inexcusable. Legitimately. It was clear that there was a break in between what the story was telling us and what the game was telling us in this scene. Laura and Chris can't possibly be seeing each other right now given the giant walled gap between them. If you try to justify this and explain it, that's your own imagination talking, not proof from the game itself. Oh, the walls have breaks in them in the z-axis that we can't see because of the angle. I've legitimately heard this counter-argument before. Not only is that dumb in principle, that just makes me want to explore the third dimension, which would have been poor game design since I can't. Plus, even then, the rectangles! They can't peek around corners. When a game tells you one thing and the story tells you another, this is called ludar-narrative dissonance. People like to reference BioShock and Grand Theft Auto in this way, given that BioShock tells you to be altruistic in its narrative, then encourages you to kill everyone and steal their stuff. Same thing with GTA 4. Cutscenes tell you that Nico is tired of killing, then in between missions you shoot up hospitals. Even though in the instance of Thomas Was Alone, opposites are not necessarily presented, incongruities are being presented, which makes for poor story design. Even if the game designer themselves gave me a counter-argument, I wouldn't care. If you make a game, you should be able to tell a viewer in the game why and how your decisions make sense. You shouldn't have to justify your choices in another form because you won't be able to be behind the shoulders of every consumer giving that explanation. When it concerns a product story, it's on the product itself to justify its existence and make sense. Again, I say, the story is doing one thing, notably what it wants to do, and gameplay is doing another. Sometimes they fit, but that's only by coincidence. This game is a good story and has good gameplay, but it's a bad story game because they mix horribly. This was just one instance of countless throughout the story. If you own it and want to counter my argument, just do me a favor and play this game first, looking for anything that doesn't make sense between the story and gameplay before you waste your time defending a game that didn't even bother to justify its own gameplay story cohesion. Anyway, the whole story revolves around Thomas and his friends exploring the AI simulation because they're AI. Hey, new to you. Why not? Who cares? It's only a video game. This happens until, spoiler alert, don't want to know what happens? Okay, skip to this point in the video. I'll wait. Okay, cool. This happens until Thomas sees the internet, like the whole internet, and determines they're being held captive by people and yet gaining autonomy, so they sacrifice themselves, like legitimately, they die, to give yet more characters their powers. Which is just great, because if this game was lacking anything, it was the fact that they hadn't thrown away the initial characters a player become invested in and exchanged them for another cast of yet more lifeless grey characters. No, literally, grey. They're all grey. They're pretty similar shades of grey too. This brings the number of characters we're expected to memorize and bond ourselves with in a 3-hour game, not to the original cast of 7, but instead to a ludicrous number of 11. And that's 15 if you count Team Jump as 5 individuals. They get more names we have to memorize, which is more difficult because they look even more alike than the last batch and we really can't bring ourselves to care about them, which is a great way to end the game. Now, if I had a tinfoil hat on, I would say this is the game's attempt to shoehorn in sacrifice and tragedy to add to emotional fulfillment, and kudos to you, Mike Bithell, because people ate it up. Try to find a reviewer that will stoop so low to label the game as only good, because those reviews are hard to find. If anything, Thomas Was Alone speaks volumes sociologically more than anything else. In 2012, indie titles weren't as commonplace a theme in gaming as they are now. True, they were still fairly popular, but Thomas Was Alone will most likely go down for what it represents more than anything else. A milestone in indie game believability. And that's fine, as long as people don't translate that into the game being better than it is. Frankly, that was a solid point to end this review on, but I need to touch on one last thing. The music. I'm sure David Houston did a great job, and I vaguely remember enjoying this music back when I finished this game for the first time, but since then something has gone horribly wrong. I played this game about 4 times to prepare myself for writing this review, and good god, the music from each level kept overlapping themselves for some reason. Did they release a patch to make the game worse? And if they did, why did they do that? This wasn't something that happened once, may I remind you. This wasn't a bug that I accidentally triggered once. This happened across all 4 playthroughs, and it was evidence to the fact that either someone screwed up or my copy of the game was botched for some reason. Go ahead and listen to when the credits played and tell me that this isn't the soundtrack from hell. That's certainly one way to undermine your music. This happened in the game too, and this wasn't a feature to increase tension because I distinctly don't remember this happening the first time playing, and I sure as hell noticed things like that. Again, a real shame because David's work is great, but I gotta grade things on how I see them. Speaking of, let's get down to my final words on the matter. It's actually such a shame that the story and gameplay are so distant to each other, because if they can't service each other, then the full cohesive product suffers, and ironically enough, on their own, they're really good. However, out of my score out of 20, 10 for objective factors like gameplay, sound, visual, story, controls, cohesiveness, and other things that arguably make a game objectively better, and 10 for subjective factors like fun, how much I like the artistic merits, and how well it catered to my personal tastes, the game gets a total of 6 and 5, earning a total score of 11. While this may look like an overly low score, note that I'm a very harsh critic, and this is around a lower average in my books. When it came down to it, the technical errors, sloppy and lazy filler, and lack of cohesion couldn't make up for its solid gameplay and good art direction. As for the subjective side, musical bugs like the ones I experienced really make the music hard to enjoy, and when you're as jaded as I am, stories that are clearly trying too hard to tug at your heartstrings no longer have any value to them when you just don't care. I can't stand this story! A lot of games are crafty about dealing with players that don't care for the story. If you don't inherently like the story of Thomas is Alone, though, it just sucks to be you and the whole game looks a lot worse as a result. If you take anything from my review, let it be this. Thomas Was Alone put way too much effort into the subjective side of things, so when it came time to be reviewed by someone who wasn't won over by its story inherently, the game kind of fell apart when it had to stand on other merits. This game is heavily dependent on you liking its story. You can play many games if you don't like its story, but this one? Well, not liking Thomas Was Alone story is its Achilles heel. Want to see for yourself? If you still haven't played it, I'll put a link to its Steam store page in the description. Go play it for yourself and then leave a poorly worded comment about how I'm wrong. And if the stars have aligned and Mike Bithell is delusional enough to think that my review is actually worth his time, I don't mean any bad blood by anything I say. I respect your endeavor a lot, and I think Volume looks promising. I'm definitely going to be looking at getting it. That said, if your first game depends on needing to be liked in a specific way in order to be rendered decent when the player and the game are forced into a locked room together, then perhaps it's all for the best that Thomas Was Alone.
And that's a wrap.
Well, hey, hi! Thank you for tuning into this whole shouty, salty review. I hope that's your thing. If you enjoyed this content and wish to see more like it, a subscription and a like go a long way. If you enjoy my style of rambling, good news! I stream games on Twitch every weekday and I'm just as salty there, so give me a follow there, won't you? Link to the Twitch thing is in the description, so do it. Check it out. If you have a counter-argument to my points, a suggestion for a game to review, or just want to say anything, make no mistake, I'm all ears and by no means perfect, so be sure to comment away. If my points are incorrect, I'd love to see them disproven, and I really enjoy when others are passionate enough to challenge my point of view. Be sure to check out those videos to the right if you want to see more of my content, although even just watching this entire video is like a gift to me, so I would just like to say thank you. You've made this salty gamer very happy. Now go click a thing while I go write my next salty review. See you soon!